As you'll hear today, each panellist has a different marker of when the trigger points have occurred, but there is no doubt that duty around climate and environmental issues is under increasing scrutiny. So to begin, I'd like to introduce our three panellists. Firstly, it's my pleasure to introduce Harriet Cater. Harriet is Climate Lead Australia with the Australasian Centre for Corporate Responsibility. ACCR is both a research and a shareholder advocacy organisation, and one of its four focal points is climate and environment. Harriet has worked in greenhouse gas accounting, in compliance and decarbonisation strategies with energetics, in impact investing on renewable energy projects with IBA, the Indigenous Business Australia, and is a founding member of Australian Parents for Climate Action. Welcome, Harriet, and thank you so much. Dr. Nick Wood is currently both a director of the consultancy Climate Policy Research and a climate risk expert with energetics. With a doctorate in nuclear physics, Nick has over 3 decades experience in climate change policy research, emissions trading, risk mitigation and impact. He was formerly head of carbon advisory at KPMG and chaired the stakeholder advisory group with the Nest Climate Hub for over 2 years. Thanks so much, Nick, and welcome.
Thank you.
And Oliver Freedman is Senior Vice President of Client Services Asia Pacific at the RepTrak company and has a long career in market research, reputation measurement and management, and brand consulting. The RepTrak company finds that ESG requirements is increasingly viewed as vital to assessing company performance, but a challenge remains in translating this into consumer language. Thank you, Oliver, for being with us as well. The way I think it would be great to run this session is to give each of our panellists the opportunity to speak for 5 minutes about the work they're currently doing and about the moment that we are in 2022 in relation to their work. And just before I invite Harriet to speak, if you have any questions, please put them into the chat and they'll be kind of sifted through and sent through to me where we can actually slip them into the conversation. Over to you, Harriet.
Thank you very much, Meri and Leah, for having me, and hello, everybody. I'm joining you from Canberra on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country today. Thanks, Meri. I didn't expect you to give that background on ACCR, so you've saved me a bit of time. As mentioned, I sit in our national climate team. We specifically focus on the climate impacts of the most carbon intensive ASX listed companies. We've got long-standing engagement with Woodside, with Santos, with BHP, Rio Tinto, AGL and Origin Energy, along with a broader range of companies as well. ACCR was founded in 2012 by Howard Pender here in Canberra. He was observing the rising use of shareholder advocacy in the US and was very keen to replicate the models that were being used there in Australia. The primary tool of shareholder advocacy is the use of shareholder resolutions that are filed to be voted on at company AGMs. It was not an easy feat for Howard to land on the mechanism to be able to file a shareholder resolution here in Australia. However, he cracked the code and in doing so has enabled both ACCR and a number of other organisations in Australia to use this tool. Importantly, shareholder resolutions in Australia are non-binding. So even though we may get substantial votes on those resolutions, companies are not obligated to implement the ask of the resolution. And so you might ask why we focus so much time on a tool like that doesn't mandate action. We find that even without the mandatory nature of the resolutions, it drives really important conversations with companies and their institutional investors on key issues relating to climate change, but equally First Nations rights and human rights and beyond. We have found that resolutions that have secured relatively minor support, even as low as 7%, have led to quite significant real-world outcomes. But additionally, the opposite can be true. In recent years, we've seen significant growing support for our shareholder resolutions. In 2020, we secured 50% support for our resolution at Woodside, seeking that the company set Paris-aligned emissions reduction targets across its scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. Similarly, in 2021, we secured our first majority support vote at AGL, where we got 53% support on a resolution seeking that the company set or commit to setting Paris-aligned emissions reduction targets for the proposed demerged companies that it plans to execute following a shareholder vote this year. Unfortunately, in both instances, we haven't seen the action that we've requested and that a significant share of shareholders have also requested. This doesn't mean that the mechanism of a shareholder resolution is dead. It definitely still has utility on different issues and with different companies. But where we're not seeing the necessary response, alternative tactics absolutely have to be explored. And this is definitely, a very current discussion now. Those tactics predominantly focus around directors, as well as options relating to litigation. So for directors, there's sort of two streams of discussions happening, queries around whether the current composition of boards have got the capacity to address and respond to climate change. So that's the conversation around climate competence. And so there are sort of current conversations in Australia, and we saw some really a big outcome with Exxon and the Engine No. 1 campaign last year. We're looking at who might be appropriate leaders for some of our most emissions intensive companies to drive a science-aligned transition. Similarly, there are alternative levers that won't necessarily require board renewal, but certainly mechanisms to send a strong message to directors through, protest votes against re-elections, which won't necessarily see directors not be elected. And we saw that with Woodside last year, where BlackRock voted against the re-election of the longest standing director in lieu of the chair of their sustainability board committee being up for re-election due to Woodside's failure to set scope 3 emission reduction targets following that significant support for the 2020 resolution. There's also, I might stop there on directors, there's so much to say. And then on the litigation front, whilst many of you are probably aware of the disappointing decision relating to the Sharma case yesterday, that absolutely doesn't change the fact that there is an absolute wave of climate litigation being planned and pursued across the globe and in Australia as well. That is being targeted at all levels of government, as well as companies. Some of you may be aware that ACCR has filed proceedings in the federal court against Santos, in which we allege that the company has undertaken misleading and deceptive conduct through making claims that its gas is clean and that they have a clear and credible pathway to achieve net zero by 2040, whilst concurrently seeking to significantly expand their oil and gas operations. I'll just flag, I can't take any specific questions on that case because it's really before the court and we don't want to undermine those proceedings. So yeah, in summary, I mean, ACCR, coming back to the purpose of the webinar, our focus really is to sort of illuminate risks, to draw attention to risks, to get companies to act on risks. I have no doubt that we are probably seen as the risk by a number of companies. But, we do this because, like the rest of the climate movement, we have a huge sense of urgency around the need to act. The recent Working Group 2 report, again, is a reminder of just the narrow window of time and opportunity that we have to avert, the worst of warming. And this absolutely informs, our approach and tactics and is the reason we do what we do. Thank you, Meri.
Harriet, thank you so much. There's lots to go back to there, but I'll let Nick go ahead now and introduce himself. Dr. Nick Wood.
Hi, thank you very much. Real pleasure to be here this afternoon. So my name's Nick Wood. I've been working in the sort of broadest climate policy for the last 25, 30 odd years. Essentially, what we do at Energetics is focus very much on, let's call it the future that's not going to be there. So what we mean by that is that climate change essentially has arrived and it's constraining our future options for a successful, prosperous society. The approach we take is really breaks down into three kind of main themes. The first one is scare the money. So climate change it basically is a problem of financial risk allocation. This is advice I gave the CSRO 6 years ago, and they said, so what do we do? You go, you scare the money, and you scare the money as badly and hard as you possibly can. And to do that, you use the science, because the science is the best factual information that you've got. You use what you've got, use the weapons that God gave you. The third point is really about driving. You can't just go, it's all bad, it's all bad, it's all bad. You have to come up with solutions. You have to help and catalyze those changes. So the third line of that, the third part of that river is really drive capability and push innovation as hard as you can. Now, innovation, when you say innovation, people go, they start thinking of, Elon Musk and flying cars and whatever. That's not what we mean. What we mean is innovation in all things. Innovation in law. How does the law regard greenwashing? How does the law understand, the climate disclosures? How does the law understand climate science? We do that. Another area is finance. So how do the finance mechanisms, the risk allocation, the correlations, all those analysis, all that stuff that can be done, how does that manage climate risk? How does it manage climate uncertainty? Again, that's another aspect we develop and push on, because they're important levers. Those are the levers that move money in our society. The third one is really around that sort of, let's call it the evidence framework, the accounting, the processes and systems we've built up over 350 years of capitalism to basically account for and correctly kind of allocate risk, finance, profit, and all the other things. The most powerful mechanisms we have essentially are, our capital markets and our science. And how do you put those together? That's been a really difficult challenge over the last 10 years. But that essentially is the core of what we're trying to do. Now, climate risk is not just another risk. It's a completely different sort of tone and texture to risks that businesses kind of face. And one way we view it is it's really a systemic risk. So it's like a river changing direction. All businesses are in that river, and it kind of carries them along with it. So essentially you go, well, okay, so what particular features make it not like another risk? I can name 3 of those. One of those is what we call hostile analytics. Now, hostile analytics basically says that the information that I need to form a view of the risk to a company sit in open source data, climate models, scientific literature. So I do not need that company's information to form a view of their constrained future. Another feature of kind of what we do is really around the fact that we're in a new world. So all of our risk management tools essentially assume a stationary world, a stationary climate, which humans have been involved in the last 2,000 years plus. That is no longer true. So essentially, we have a challenge that our risk management tools are becoming less effective, increasingly less effective as we move into the climate changed new world. The third point about it is really the constrained futures. And this is where the climate physical aspects and the emission aspects come together. So one of the really positive developments recently has been on the sort of science-based targets and the Paris agreements. The basic is you have to be zero emissions by 2050. Now, net's a rather odd word. Net is basically, in my view, fading out of this discussion because there is no net to net. So zero emissions by 2050. And I think that's a very useful, not more than useful, it's a very essential part of this conversation, but I don't think we're quite settled on it as to how that works yet. So really looking forward to this discussion. So it's a fascinating and very, very scary topic. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Nick. And finally to you, Oliver, where is the RepTrak company at in this moment in 2022?
Thank you. Thanks everybody for the opportunity to chat today. We've been measuring corporate reputations since trying to think 1997, 1998. That's when I sort of started to work with companies to understand their perceptions in the broader community. And I think about the journey that I've been on and that we've been on as a company during that time. And, at the beginning, it really was probably coming out of a marketing area of an organization, maybe a corporate affairs, but I rarely got to speak to a CEO. And what I've seen, what I believe and I've seen change over time is really the expectation of CEOs and senior leadership in companies from the community. I think if we go back to the 90s, a good CEO was almost one that delivered great financial returns for the company, whether that be, you know, Kerry Packer, whether that be a Jerry Harvey, or whether that be, you know, whoever it might be, you know, around the world. As we moved into the 2000s, what I saw was that obviously .com and the Amazons and the Facebooks and Apple, the CEO took on, not only did they have to deliver great financial returns, but their job was also deliver great capability, great customer experience, and great innovation. And that was the buzzword for the clients that I speak to. That was that decade. It was all about CX, to use that language, customer experience. As we moved into the last decade, what a change we saw. And I think it actually didn't necessarily start from an environment perspective. It started with corporate behavior. It started with the Enrons of the world, the OneTels here, and really culminated in Australia in some ways with the Royal Commission to Banking. And there was now a requirement for leaders of companies to show great character. Are they good people? Do we as a community see them and go, I can trust them to make a decision that is for the good of the community? Not just the good of shareholders, not just the good of employees, not just the good of customers, but actually for the good of the community. And so we're seeing now, and I think what's important is each stage was additive. And so we've now got a situation where leaders of companies are very much required to still deliver those great financial returns. And that becomes challenging when you add on, they also have to deliver incredible innovation and customer experience. And now they have to deliver character. And really, you know, for me, what I see is for most companies, the role of sustainability, environment is almost, that's the proof point. Do they think about the benefit of the world when they're deciding their plans? And, you know, I can deliver a great financial return in 2 years and my customers might be happy. But if that's not dealing with the issues that we have to deal with as a world, then that is not a good character. And so I think that I've definitely seen, we've seen that in our drivers, the third biggest driver of reputation. Some might prefer it to wish it was number one, but the third biggest is citizenship, which includes that aspect of what are you doing from environment. The first biggest, either equal with the product and service, or actually sometimes ahead of it is, are you honest? Are you ethical? Are you transparent? And I think Nick, you mentioned greenwashing. They are petrified of that, because that goes to the sense of, do they have good conduct? And does the community actually see that? And so that is an incredible challenge for these organizations. They are struggling with what it means for them. It's a new world for many of the leadership teams. And then what we've added really in the last year, and then I'll end on this point, what we've added in the last year to two, and I think probably Harriet and Nick, you're closer to this than me, is I have for years, no one from investor relations was that interested in talking to us at RepTrak. They had their own measures among the investors. They knew what they wanted and they dealt with it. And I would talk about what the community wanted. And they're like, yeah, we're going to focus on what the investors. That has changed, I think, in the last 1 to 2 years, where the investment community are actually in some ways leading the community. And I think it's exactly as you said, Nick, it's around the risk. They are seeing that risk for the future. And what's happening is the community are in some ways also being brought along in terms of that aspect around environment. And so there is a different dynamic within, at least from what I'm seeing within corporate Australia, when I speak to my colleagues in the US and Europe, there is a different dynamic now with leaders needing to show financial capability and character, and with investors almost in a pincer movement saying, what are you doing in this space? And so I'm optimistic. It is not easy. There are a lot of struggles to balance all of these demands because as I think I've shared with you, Meri, at one point, if all they did was focus on character and they missed all their financials, those investors turn very quickly, as we've seen in Europe a couple of times. So it is really a balancing act for them, but it is now a balancing act, whereas before it probably wasn't even something to be balanced. So I'll leave it there and look forward to the discussion.
Oh, thanks so much, Oliver. Leadership is such a key pillar of this. I definitely want to get back to that in the conversation. But Harriet, if I can return to you, I think Shana is obviously on everybody's minds at the moment. And from the perspective that you can speak about it, was the decision predictable, and what happens next?
Yeah, I think It was not, I think there was sort of, perhaps it wasn't expected that the full federal court bench would come down against the original decision. That was a surprise. There was sort of, the decision was delayed, and so it was anticipated that there was some pretty rigorous discussion. It is generally been viewed that this case has certainly hit a bump in the road, but it hasn't gone away, and it was expected that whomever was unsuccessful in the federal court would take the case to the High Court. That hasn't been formally communicated by equity generation lawyers as yet, but that is expected. Yeah.
And you talked about a wave of climate litigation. Can you talk more broadly about, I guess, the general thought on the usefulness of climate litigation at this point in time?
I mean, I think it comes under the banner of like no option is being left on the table, but certainly decisions by courts can be more swift and effective than other kind of slower actions that perhaps require the shift in sort of political decision makers. Yeah, but we are certainly seeing, at ACCR, we have dialogue with a number of different climate litigators in Australia and internationally. And it is our observation that this is very, very creative thinking being thrown at this challenge, again, coming back in the spirit of really trying to halt fossil fuel expansion predominantly, but, all activities that are delaying our capacity to decarbonise as swiftly as we need to.
Nick, do you talk about the risk of litigation to your clients?
Increasingly so. So part of that is driven by the let's call it the misuse, the unintended misuse of science to give an impression of a future which is kind of not supportable. So that's certainly a concern around some of the disclosures by the sort of large sort of funds and people. They go, this isn't actually scientific. So you may have tripped yourself into this, but this comes with a litigation risk because it's provable that this is a non-scientific approach. So that's of a concern. So one of the reasons we wrote a paper in there was published in Nature Climate Change last year with Andy Pittman from the University of New South Wales and others, was to highlight the fact that in making these types of disclosures, you are exposing yourself to potential, it's wrong, and potential litigation risk. So we do, yes.
Sorry, Meri, can I just add,
Sure.
just on that though, like litigation, and on the greenwashing point as well, we're seeing that ASIC and the ACCC are coming out, like regulators are starting to fill the void. So it's not just left to Nick through his advisory and us through our efforts to kind of force the point here. The regulators are very aware now of the issue of greenwashing across a whole host of sectors. So that could quite swiftly see another correction in this conduct.
But Harriet, do you feel like it's organisations like ACCR that have had to drive that so that ASIC steps up?
I think it would be fair to say that ASIC has not sort of been chasing the issue of greenwashing as closely as perhaps it should have been over the last few years, but we certainly welcome the shift in their messaging now.
And Nick, just returning to you then, just on the greenwashing, because both Oliver and you mentioned greenwashing in your introductions. Do you think that the organisations are deliberately greenwashing when they're greenwashing, or that perhaps there's some level of just they don't have the capability of understanding what they're putting out into the world and what they're telling the world about their actions?
Interesting question. I think it's a combination of a lack of familiarity with the subject, particular sort of deeper uncertainties that come with climate science, a rather open and unregulated sort of almost explosion in sort of climate intelligence tools that we're seeing across the marketplace, which essentially they're unregulated, and then also what we call the easy route out. So climate change is a very difficult problem, and if somebody appears and offers you a simple analysis-driven solution that gives you a metric, it feels good, you do it. And so there's a combination of three things. There's not one factor, but there's multiple factors that weave into that. You end up at the same point. You end up with a corporate disclosure, which is unprovable.
Yeah. And Oliver, just going back to litigation with you then, is that something that's on the minds of your clients?
It's always on their mind, because we know from a reputational perspective that is one of the, most damaging things to reputation. Not only the actual result, but the process itself. I wouldn't say it doesn't come up a lot in the conversations with me, but I think, for me, things like the Sharma case, yesterday, what it does is it starts to shift, the thought bubble in people's minds. And so, as that's front page of the newspaper, like, oh, so what responsibility do people have long term? And what does that mean for a company? What does that, in other words, I think what happens, these things, even if they're not necessarily won in court by the people who are bringing it to court, it starts to create a narrative within society that by itself will drive changes in behavior. And so I was trying to think that, I can't think of it on the top of my head, but there are many times where we have seen, not things decided in court, but it becomes accepted by the community that this needs action. And then action occurs, because in the end, from a company perspective, these are their broad stakeholders. These are their customers. These are the people that provide feedback to the government that regulates. As Harriet mentioned, the regulators are key, and governments determine regulations, and government, I believe, will often then feed off from the voters. And so there is that circle of influence. And so I think all of these bring new ways for the community to think about who is responsible. We asked a question previously: who's responsible for certain actions? Is it government? Is it local government? Is it is it corporate Australia? Is it media? And what's interesting is that environment shifted. Historically, there was government. When government didn't succeed, it shifted to corporates. And that is the way we work in Australia, is if we don't see a success in government, we go, right, corporates, you stand up and you fix it, you deal with it. And that was a shift. And we have seen similar things with aging population, financial cost of living, same sort of thing, where we see that shift from expectation and responsibility from government through to corporates.
I found a stat from the New South Wales Law Society that at the end of last year, Australia was the top climate litigator in the world per capita, and second only to the US in number of cases since 1993. Does that surprise you, Harriet?
No, I don't think so. I guess we're a carbon intensive, developed economy with an incredible, laggard government, and all tools have to be contemplated in that environment. I would like to just link back to that point Oliver was making about expectations shifting from government to corporates around climate. I guess there's a general acceptance that this federal government is just not going to do anything. They're absolutely dug their heels in the sand, and in fact will do anything to reverse any gains. But I think it's really important for everyone to remember that is a key driver for the government that we have, and the policy paralysis that we have is the influence of corporates on the policy setting process. They've got the policy suite that they asked for. And a key ask that we're now placing on some corporates, especially those who are leaders, is that they advocate for science-aligned policy, like cease the negative advocacy and actually speak out in favour of policies that they need to be able to meet their ambitious emissions reduction targets. So I think, it doesn't surprise me in a way that everyone's diverted their attention to corporates, because basically this government doesn't talk about climate change anymore, and corporates have just filled the void. Anyway, I probably ate into your next question, Meri, sorry.
That's okay. Nick, would you like to respond to that in any way?
Tricky one. So I think that is definitely what you can observe at a certain level. If you go to a different level, you see a very different conversation. So I'll give you an example. Josh Frydenberg's speech in the National Press Club directed at large-scale institutional bondholders of Australian sovereign bonds. So basically, the view, if you sit in the sort of credit rating agencies, there's a very different conversation going on between state treasuries and credit rating and federal treasury and credit rating agencies. They're saying, actually, we've got this covered. We have the sovereign capability, we can manage this. So there are different levels, there are different conversations being had in different places. That's my own response to that. It depends what level you look at it at.
I'm not quite sure which one of you might like to respond to this, but John, who's in the audience, has said perhaps relevant that there are options between court and politics. For instance, a compliant under the OECD guidelines, for example. Nick, possibly, would you like to respond to that?
Not sure about that. I think there's, I think there are expectations from powerful actors who are non-governmental in this world that you don't see. So I think, you know, if you are a state treasury and you're having an awkward conversation with a global credit rating agency, that is a very powerful conversation. I think that can drive, that's just as effective at driving conversations internally as any other form of law or litigation or government. There are third type actors in this process you just don't see.
Harriet, any response to the thought that there are other actors that you could be engaging with?
I guess the other stakeholders that ACCR focuses a lot on, and it sort of comes back to our my comment earlier about industry influence on politics, industry associations. So the Minerals Council of Australia, the Queensland Resources Council, and so on. And so these are third-party actors that are funded by corporations who have a major role in the policy process here in Australia. And yeah, a key focus of ours is to kind of limit the influence that those associations have. Yeah.
Meri, I'd just add to that. I think, you know, one of the areas that corporates still really struggle with is prioritizing of stakeholders. And, you know, while there have been so many articles and books written on it, my experience is whoever's front of mind seems to get the priority for that week or that month. And then the next one comes along and they really struggle. We were doing a workshop a couple of weeks ago and it was like, which of these are more important? They're all important. Like, well, you need to prioritize as a business. And so I think, Nick, you're spot on. When those conversations come in, you know, and it could be from let's take a corporate space. It could be from a senior investor. From the investor relations, it's the most important person. That then ends up in the leadership team at the same time they've got their NPS from their customer. And then they've got something else from the community. And I think that is a space where corporates are going to have to make the really tough decisions, because often there's a feeling of they're all important, but going forward, it's going to become, I think it's going to become, you know, contradictory at some point. And so I think that is something that I guess corporates will have to work really hard on and actually make those tough decisions on where those priorities lie.
I just want to throw in a comment here from Robin, who's online with us, that there's been a failure of successive governments at a federal level to address climate change matters. We can't lay the blame solely at the current one. State and territory governments have failed to varying degrees, but all need to do more about adaptation measures. Thanks so much for that comment, Robin, and I'm sure everyone online would.
Yeah, absolutely not going to disagree with you, Robin. And sorry, I probably sound like a broken record, but the state capture in Western Australia in particular is just stunning. You know, just last week, the West Australian government released a media release in partnership with APAC, the oil and gas lobby. It's just, yeah, it's staggering the influence the oil and gas industry has in Western Australia, and is absolutely putting a handbrake on any effective policy measures in that state, in your state, I'm assuming.
Yes. Well, that leads beautifully into my next question, because I guess the other side of state capture is about the social license that some of these organisations that have the state captured are getting from sponsorship of the arts and sport. And Oliver, I want to go to you on this about corporate sponsorship. And for example, you know, Tennis Australia recently dropping Santos as a sponsor. How does that make an impact in the reputation conversation?
Yeah, look, I think, you know, it's interesting when someone drops them, right? It's how it's communicated. So often, you know, the knowledge of sponsorship is a lot less than companies actually think, and has less of an impact on reputation, in my view, than it does within the broader community. Now, there are key stakeholders that are very happy to see them supporting arts or sport or whatever it would be. I think we haven't seen a huge amount where there's been a very public, I'll call it dropping of a sponsor, and I think that would have impact, because that's a sense of an organization that probably needs the sponsorship dollars, but is actually made a decision based on, to use my word earlier, the character of that organization. And that's really what we're seeing there, is if that is viewed as, and the organization that has ended that sponsorship, it's viewed as a proof point of lacking character, that will have, and in character I call about that, you know, ethical, open, transparent, helping the environment, that space, then that will have an impact. If it is just viewed by the community, the merry-go-round of sponsorship that happens in all, you know, think of our favorite sports event or our favorite arts event, that it's, you know, someone does it for 3 years or 5 years and then they move on, it's somebody else, then in the broad community, my view is it has less impact, because it just gets lost in the noise. So I think the interesting thing is how that is portrayed, and I guess how noisy an organization is happy to be to say that they don't want that sponsorship, and then how transparent the company, they'll never want to be, is made to be on the reason for that. And that's where coverage is so important, and how stories are portrayed as impacting reputation, because there will, you know, for those of us who read the back page of the newspaper and read the, you know, the fin and read the inside stories or wherever it is, we're not the majority on this. The majority are reading a front page or just going to an event and seeing a different sponsor. And so I think that's where that's the challenge on those, whether they're really going to have an impact. But over time, it will, especially if industries are blocked out from sponsoring. That has a bigger effect, because it actually says this industry is not one that we want to be seen to be sponsoring. And obviously there are many, I call, you know, individuals who have certain industries who they feel shouldn't be allowed to sponsor certain events. There's the range of them at the moment. It's not just within the environment space. There's obviously people with views in the gaming space. There's people with views in the alcohol space. And really all of those are having a view that those industries need to change, or their actions are negative to society. And therefore we need to have a way to stop them appearing to be a help to society. But as of this point, really, other than tobacco, that hasn't it hasn't really occurred.
Harriet, do you have a sense of how the fossil fuel industry might end up finally losing their social license?
I was just thinking that, Meri. Because you know, it's hailed as the kind of the key social tipping point in climate change, is getting the industry to lose their social license. I mean, you can see if you do mapping, and people, you know, I have peers who've done this mapping in terms of, you know, what sporting teams and arts events and so on the fossil fuel industry is funding. It's extraordinary. So, I mean, Oliver, I'd love to talk about this more with you another time, because there must be a reason they're doing this, right? I guess our view is that they are acutely aware that their days are numbered in terms of having social license. I think there is an emerging conversation happening now in Australia, finally, where people are connecting the dots between severe climate disasters, such as the just devastating flooding that's occurred across the east coast of Australia, and fossil fuels. I think a number of people are finding it a pretty tough pills to swallow, that they can no longer afford insurance, whilst these industries are absolutely booming in terms of, you know, commodity pricing at this point in time. And yet those are the industries that have led to, you know, have contributed materially to these impacts that we're seeing. So the faster that can happen, the faster people make those connections, the faster that social license will be lost. And I'm all ears in terms of strategies there, because it cannot happen fast enough.
Nick, what are your thoughts on this?
Interesting. So I think it's quite a nuanced discussion. And I think a lot of the acceptability and social license comes down to what do you personally use that fossil fuel for. So, you know, if we go back to the 1990s and there's, you know, the Shell oil and the Ngoni base in Nigeria and the murder of Ken Saro-Wiwa, an oil company implicating the murder of a Nobel laureate, that's not a pretty good social license condition to be in. That's a lot of negative press. Brent Spar was the same in the UK. I think if you have a conversation about fossil fuels and flying, you'll get a very different answer. So I think you'd be careful about throwing, literally the baby out with the bathwater. This is not as simple as fossil fuels bad. Hang on, I want to go on a plane to Adelaide. Okay, that's a bit more complicated. I'll turn this entire argument on its head. Here's a question for you. Is it really the fault of the fossil fuel industry? So here's the crux. If you take the nuclear industry, all the money been spent on nuclear. Now I've got a PhD in nuclear physics. We spent all the money you ever spent on nuclear over the last 70 years of existence and spent that on renewable energy, we wouldn't have a fossil fuel industry problem today. So people blame fossil fuel, but we made a lot of decisions, other decisions in history that put us in this place. So you go, well, blaming fossil fuel, but hang on a minute. That was a decision, a door we closed off 50 years ago. So again, this idea that responsibility for the future, not to the future, is a thing that we often focus on. It's decisions you make today define the future you get tomorrow. So the problem we got today, fossil fuels are going, well, you made the decision not to invest in renewables 50 years ago.
Yeah. I remember Christiana Figueres, the former chief executive secretary of the UNFCCC, saying that it's, we have to kind of thank the fossil fuel industry for where they got us to at a point in time, but we now need to put that dinosaur in the museum and move on. And just before I move on from this topic, I just want to comment from Kelly about about the social license. That BP being dropped by Tate in London due to artists calling for removal of their sponsorship was a massive wake-up call to Australian artists. And she also asks, in what ways corporates can exercise their power and influence over government policy? Who would like to respond to that? Oliver. Or Harriet. Nobody.
You go, Oliver. I can, if you, yeah.
Yeah, obviously they have access, right? So obviously they have incredible resources. They have, people that have sat on the other side of the table that then move out and sit within corporate spaces. They know how it works, and they have that ability to do that. I can tell you though, in terms of working with them, they don't feel that they have control over that, right? So in other words, there's always this sense that I always think about when you buy a house. If you're buying the house, you feel the seller has all the power. When you're selling the house, you feel the buyer has all the power. The other person always feels that they're always in control. So what I can say is that, I think at RepTrak, we do get a chance to speak to a really broad and diverse group of individuals and organizations. And they have, corporates have an ability to speak with decision makers. They feel that, they don't have control over it in any way.
Can I just interrupt you there for a sec? I have to ask, do you genuinely think the fossil fuel industry feels that the government is in control in Australia?
To some degree, yes. Not completely, but yeah, I would. I'd say that they have to respond in a certain way to protect their social license to operate. I do. So again, are they fully in control? Do they have a say? Yes, but I would say that they are. That's why, to Harriet's point, people are worried. If not, you wouldn't see the actions that were going on. They wouldn't even speak to Nick. They wouldn't even talk to him because it doesn't matter. But they see change. They see movement. They're trying to work out where do they go, and they're also saying, my investors, where's my share price going to be in 20 years from now? What's it going to look like? What are we going to be as a company? How are we going to operate? And my responsibility is to find a way through this incredibly complex area. So I don't think it's as simple to think that they sit back and think, I'm in control, I've got it. So that would be my view.
Thank you. Just because I'm aware of time, we've only got 13 minutes left, and there are a couple of points I still want to get to. Nick, I'd really like to ask you to talk about risk a little bit more. And you talked to me previously about the problem of approaching this issue as a risk management issue and how that stops you from unlocking creativity. Could you speak about that a little bit more, please?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, it's a very interesting theme which has emerged from quite recently from a book called Radical Uncertainty by Irving King, who's a former Deputy Governor of the Bank of England, and John Kay, who's an economist. And it tapped into a lot of the discussions that we were having around risk management and climate change. And the basic premise was that the way we view it is that we're moving into a new world, a world where the climate is non-stationary. We've basically changed it and are changing it. We're not taking it from point A to point B. We're taking it from point A to we don't know where this is going. So that's a fundamental that's a new world that we're in. The observation that the authors of the book made was that the way humans evolved in a very uncertain world, that our ancestors just did not have the view of the future. They just had to live with what they lived with. But humans evolved to deal with that through innovation. So we basically kind of connected these dots and went, okay, so if you're doing risk management, you're basically trying to analyze and quantify and sort of, control, constrain the future. But that robs you of the fear. So if you think about sectors that are innovating most in the face of climate change, they're ones that are frightened of climate change, particularly agriculture. So we do a lot of work on agriculture, and farmers are very, very innovative because they see the consequences and they feel the consequences, and it's their livelihoods. And we've all seen that on the news and the rest of it. So basically, fear equals innovation. Risk management is a play at dumbing down that fear. So it's a kind of, you kind of think, hang on, what is Nick Wood talking about? But this is kind of inside the brain. This is a sort of process and psychology. So it's like, okay, so in order to, and you think about, okay, who is the most innovative person we've got in the face of climate change? You go, well, it's Elon Musk. Yes, it is Elon Musk, because you look at what they're doing. They're changing the entire narrative, the entire structure, the entire system of how you do this. And there are many more places where that can occur. So what we're saying is risk management can only get you so far, not that far, actually. Innovation is really what you need to do. But to be innovative, you need to realize where you are. You need to realize that, we are in an uncertain future and we have to do something. So I don't want to be too overplaying this, but essentially it's an idea that the business approach to climate change should not be one of 100% risk management. There has to be an innovation piece. So when we ask an organization about what are you doing about climate change, and they go, oh, we're doing risk management. Yeah, okay, and so where is the innovation piece? And also, just to go on a little bit, I think that breaks the current deadlock we've got in the inability of organizations to go, don't worry, be happy in the short term, it's all fine, but long term going, we've no idea how we're going to get to 2030 or net zero 2050. We've no idea how to do that. And I think that breaks the narrative, because it was, okay, we are where we are now, but innovation is the answer we need to connect those two timeframes. So interesting read. It's great to put it together with Swiss Re and Plex, and it's proved quite opened quite a lot of discussions. But it's we enjoy talking to clients about it and just getting the reaction and seeing how they want to do it. So thank you.
Thanks. Harriet, I want to go to you on this, because I feel like there's a sense of urgency around this now. In 2022, we're heading to, we're into the critical decade, and that the idea that, we need to be more creative and innovative seems kind of terrifying, because that gives the impression that we have a long time to muck around with ideas before we come up with the solutions. Do you have any response to that, or to anything that you did there?
It was interesting hearing Nick talk, and I think the thing that struck me is to have that, to get to that point of that innovation, and to really come up with those really kind of effective and world-changing solutions, is a very clear-eyed acceptance of the science, and we're not necessarily seeing that in a lot of the companies that we engage with yet. I loop back to my point about climate competence in boards. I often think you can define climate competence a whole range of different ways, but one is that a person is climate competent if they've had their oh shit moment in terms of the science, and that is then the catalyst for the innovation that Nick speaks of. I mean, it's our only option, Meri, in terms of expediting the action that's required. Thanks.
Yeah. A comment from Charlie, a great point from you, Nick Wood. Creativity needs fear, constraint is the mother of convention, in inverted commas. Risk management approach will lead to businesses getting stuck in the status quo. Thank you for that, Charlie. Oliver, I want to go to you about Harriet's oh shit moment. Do you think that broadly your clients have reached or are reaching their oh shit moment?
No. They had it around character at the Banking Royal Commission. So you want to know about ethics, you want to know about making sure that we don't basically, we're clear on what we're doing, and that was that moment. I mean, for me, it was actually the 4 CEOs. And if you remember on the News Limited, I think it was Daily Telegraph and probably Herald Sun, it was just basically the 4 CEOs on the front page. And I can't remember the headline, but any senior leader in an organization seeing that and watching the Royal Commission live, that's their moment. I never want to be there. I don't think we've had that yet around climate environment. I don't think, was it the fires? Is it the floods now? Not quite. I'm not feeling that urgency inside the organization yet. So I don't think so. I think it feels like we're still a way off, is my honest answer. I wish I could tell you it would be sooner, but I'm not seeing that. It could be a legislative decision, right? It could be a new federal government, right, where suddenly they feel that the social license to operate is really at risk. I didn't talk about that, but there's not really a feeling that anyone's social license to operate is ever going to be removed. I mean, they tried to remove that for the greyhounds and it got reversed. So there's not, I don't think there's a fear that really a company is going to be shut down from operating. It may take it. It may take one case. It may take a company overseas in probably US or UK for that to actually occur, and then people have that moment. But I actually think we're still a little way off, and it's going to take something major that will impact them dramatically.
Thank you. I want to stick with you, Oliver, because in the last 5 minutes, I want to go back to the conversation about leadership and to ask whether corporates are still walking a fine line where they're trying to perhaps do the right thing in relation to climate and environment, but also are concerned about the idea of being seen as activists within their peer group. Do you have any sense of the worry around that?
In some industries, yes, and there's history there where government stepped in and asked companies not to be at a certain position. So there's history there where they've been asked to tone it down at different points in time. So I think,
can you give an example of that at all?
I don't know if I can, so I'm not going to. So I don't know what's publicly available and not. So but I think in terms of that, yeah, no company really wants to be the standout. Like, they all want to differentiate, but not too much, right? You don't want to be left alone at the front of the queue, taking the heat from the groups that view it a different way. And remember, it's only been well, let's say a year or two where really investors have been pushing for this. Previously, if you were the company up front, you were the one who were probably viewed as not going to be providing great financial returns in the short term. And you were left sort of alone there while your competitors could sit there talking about their returns. So I think the investor community changed, and that focus, I think that has the ability to drive companies to want to differentiate on this, because it actually will provide potentially a greater attractive from an investment perspective. If that occurs, that will be a big change in that space.
Thank you. Nick, I'll go to you on this. We've talked about the need for transformative leadership. What do you think that actually looks like? What kind of leadership is going to get us to the place that we need to be, let's say at 2030?
I think we're starting to see examples of what that could look like. So we've been very fortunate to work with some of the biggest banks in Australia. And what we observe through that kind of just on a no-names basis is really, you may start a project with 4 or 5 people in the room. By the time you finish it 6 months later, you'll have 30 people in the room from across the different banking divisions. And then you kind of realize that, that they're actually starting to build up their own climate capabilities. They're developing the kind of software and spatial platforms. So we are starting to see that the toe in the water, the foot in the water, the calf in the water on that, but there's no single answer. We also see it very clearly in agriculture, where you've got very clear leadership statements. One of my first ever experiences was actually working with Dairy Australia, and the former chair, Kathy Phelps, was in this from the word go. Kathy Phelps was like, climate change is something we have to deal with. And she was quite unusual in her day, this is back in 2015, to say we have to deal with climate change. So we can see it in isolated examples. A more recent example, I think, is when you start to look at the power industry and the renewables. That is a massive change. There's clearly leadership in that, whether it's the battery in South Australia or the bid for AGL or all those things. So in the power sector, you're absolutely seeing it. In other corporate sectors, it's a harder ask, there's less pressures, or it's just different culture. So we're definitely starting to see it. Whereas 5 years ago, it was single figures. Now it's into multiples of 10s and 20s. I think. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Nick. Harriet, I'll leave the last word on leadership to you, and I also just want to throw in to you as well a question that's come through. How can we use the call for transparency in decision making in climate action and adaptation to increase diverse voices in boards?
I think there's an acute awareness I think that the question around diversity of boards is almost an easier conversation to have than climate competence. We certainly see that being a priority in our discussions with institutional investors. They're much more sort of hesitant to vote against women on boards and keen to see, a much broader representation, cultural representation on boards. Back to the question on leadership, I guess, and what we would like to see. A couple of years ago, Twiggy's Forrest's name would never have come to mind in terms of an example of someone who's really taking corporate leadership on this issue. And what we're seeing in Twiggy is ambition. That's really what we want to see. And some might say, there's a really, the proximity between greenwashing and ambition is a little too near for my liking in terms of, making claims that you're going to be able to achieve things that you can't. But what we want in ambition is to make statements or make targets, stretch targets, communicate with your stakeholders about the complexities of meeting those targets, but demonstrating that you're going to try as best you can to get there. And that's what we are desperately keen to see across corporate Australia, is that real escalation in ambition.
Well, thank you everybody for joining us today for this conversation about the nexus of risk, responsibility and reputation. And thanks so much to NELA for organising it. Harriet Cater, Nick Wood, Oliver Freedman, thank you so much for your time. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much. Take care. Bye.
Bye.